Who is the better quarterback, Dak Prescott or Tony Romo? We discuss that and more in this episode of the Locked On Cowboys podcast.
You are Locked On Cowboys, your daily Dallas Cowboys podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Locked On Cowboys.
Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. I am your host, Marcus Mosier. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosier. And joining me today is a very special guest. It's Elliot Harrison. You can find him on Twitter at HarrisonNFL. We've decided to have a little debate that Elliot and I have had several times offline and on the phone. Who's the better quarterback, Dak Prescott or Tony Romo? Now, I'm torn, but Elliot's got some strong feelings here that we're going to get into. So, Elliot, the floor is yours. Tell us who is the better quarterback.
Well, I think it's really close between the two, and I have earned a reputation somehow with, I guess, with you and other people that I'm some kind of Dak hater or whatever. By the way, if I looked lost in space there for a second, my page was frozen. That's not how I feel about this debate. I'm not lost in space on this debate because I have some pretty strong opinions. But I have felt for a long time that Tony Romo is the better player. Now, where he falls in Cowboys history among the greatest quarterbacks, I think is extremely debatable. But I think if you're just going to do in a vacuum Tony Romo versus Dak Prescott, I think, Marcus, it's Romo. It might be somewhat narrow, but I think there's some pretty obvious indicators.
All right, so let's take this conversation in a different direction. If you had one game, a playoff game or a big regular season game, and you can pick the year, whether it's 2014 Romo or 2018 Dak, for that one game, which quarterback are you taking?
Well, if I get to pick a quarterback in a year, I'm taking 2014 Romo. You hit the nail on the head right there. Now, I think 2018 Dak would be the strongest choice of his career because of I don't think Dak was as good a quarterback, the classic way we think of the position in 2018. But I think the way that he used his mobility and he was a threat in the red zone to run for a touchdown or get the Cowboys closer or convert a first down was really special. That said, I think the way Tony Romo played in 2014 is one of the greatest seasons any Cowboys quarterback has ever had. I think it was the zenith of his ability. It was year 12 for him. I think a lot of people don't realize that because he spent his first 3 years not playing at all. And so he always felt younger than he actually was. And I think by year 12, quarterbacks know everything you're going to throw at them. So it's really just a matter of at year 12, has their body started going backward to the point that they can't make all the throws that that their mind wants them to make. And I think in 2014, Romo wasn't there yet. Obviously, it went downhill physically very quickly, though, after that.
You made the argument for Dak, right? It's the mobility. And if obviously Dak can't run the same as he did back in 2016, 17, 18, but if you're going to make the case that Dak is the better player, I think it's the rushing ability. And, at his peak, he was getting 400 rushing yards a season with 6 touchdowns. So that's why when we're having this debate, it probably depends a little bit on which era you're playing in, right? Because yes. I feel like in today's NFL, if you can't run or you're very limited as a runner, you better be an A-plus passer like Joe Burrow. But in 2008, 2009, I don't think the rushing ability was as important.
I agree, but I think if you look at eras, you've got to cut it both ways. So if you look at Romo and Dak's numbers, because I know a lot of people now, they just want to look at numbers. And that's why we get these dumb graphics that say that Dak Prescott was better than Roger Staubach, and it drives me nuts. But by the way, if anyone thinks there's a debate on who the greatest Cowboys quarterback is of all time, please stop now.
It's Quincy Carter, yes.
Yeah, it's Quincy Carter, followed by Clint Sterner and Glenn Carano. But I would say this. They both have 97 passer ratings. If you want to start with that, I think Dak is like 97.8 and Romo's 97.1 or vice versa, but they're both at 97. Their TD to INT ratio is almost identical. Their win-loss record, there's a slight advantage to Dak, but I think supporting cast has a lot to do with that. But the difference to me is, Romo started in 2006. Dak started in 2016 in terms of when they got to play. the eras are different for throwing the football. It was so much harder, even in 2006, than it is now. I know we always talk about like, the 70s and 80s were harder to throw than now. You look at quarterbacks' median stats from, say, 2006, 2007 versus today, they're so much more efficient now. Now, if you don't have at least a 90 passer rating, you are really struggling. And that just wasn't the case. When Romo got in the league, he was one of the highest rated passers in 06. And his rating was like, I think it was 97 in 2006.
I was going to say, I think by the time he quote unquote retired or just kind of stopped being the full-time starter in 2015, I think he was like third all time in passer rating behind.
That's right.
I think was it Aaron Rodgers and Steve Young? I think were the two guys ahead of him. Now there's a million quarterbacks ahead of him. Your guy, Kirk Cousins, is way ahead of Dak now, or excuse me, of Tony Romo. So that, to your credit, like that is the one thing that has changed a lot. I think the pro Dak argument that doesn't show up on stats, it seems like everybody loves him as a leader. We just had Cole Beasley on Twitter say, Dak Prescott is the best leader I've ever played with. Cole Beasley played with Josh Allen, Tony Romo, and a guy by the name of Tom Brady at the beginning of the year. And for him to say that's the best leader I've ever played with, it's not to say Romo is a bad leader or anything like that, but I think that's one area that Dak really, really excels in.
And I would not dispute that at all. But then again, is that translating into wins and losses? And it's not. I mean, at least not in the postseason. I mean, that was the big complaint on Tony Romo, was that, that he didn't get it done in the postseason. Well, Dak Prescott hasn't gotten it done in the postseason either, in terms of getting this team even to the NFC Championship game. I mean, you'll find that these guys' careers are eerily similar in a lot of ways. They both had a problem staying on the field. And wait, what did you say?
I said it's strange. Like it's weird how similar their stats are and how they both kind of petered out like in the divisional round of the playoffs, and it's odd.
Yeah, I would say this though. You look at Dak Prescott, and this is what's really important to me. So do you mind if I just talk about Russell Wilson for a moment here?
Go ahead.
Because Russell Wilson really covers both their eras, right? And Russell Wilson, everyone was talking about how wonderful of a player he was in 2012, 13, 14, and he was fantastic. And they would compare him to Tony Romo. I'm like, this isn't even comparable. I mean, in 2013, Russell Wilson goes out there, and Marcus, what do you think? He needed about 17, 20 points to know that we're going to win.
20 points guaranteed them a victory, right?
Yeah, we're done. 2013, if I'm not mistaken, the Cowboys set a record that year for the worst defense in the history of the league in terms of yards allowed, at like 401 yards a game or something. And they went 8-7 with Romo. They went 8-8, but Kyle Orton played the last game of the season. And I just would like to point out, I'm on Pro Football Reference right now, which you and I love that website. A little plug for Pro Football Reference. Cowboys defensive ranks with Dak Prescott: 5th in points allowed in 2022, 7th in points allowed in 2021. They were 28th in 2020, but Dak Prescott barely played that year. 2019, they were 11th. 2018, they were 6th. 2016, they were 5th. I mean, really, the worst year the Cowboys defense has had when Dak has actually played was 13th in points allowed. And honestly, Marcus, most teams will take 13th in points allowed. You want me to compare that to Romo's? It's not even gonna fly. And I argue that's the most important part of your supporting cast. Your defense, maybe your offensive line second, and then your receivers.
I'm glad that you brought up the supporting cast.
Here we go.
I think this is an area where Dak Prescott's supporting cast has been far inferior to Tony Romo's. We will talk about that next. This episode is brought to you by eBay Motors. Our partners at eBay Motors have teamed up with Locked On Fantasy Football host Vinny Iyer to bring you some of the best fantasy picks each and every week, all season long. Whether you're prepping for a draft or scouting the waiver wire, every week we're going to provide you players that are guaranteed to fit on your roster. So with draft prep underway for the upcoming season, let's see who Vinny has picked out for us in this week's eBay's Guaranteed Fit Fantasy Picks of the Week. This week, it's Justin Jefferson. When on the clock with the number 1 overall pick in 2023 fantasy drafts, it's okay to get downright giddy about doing the gritty. That means picking Vikings wide receiver Justin Jefferson, who is a guaranteed fit. Over the past 2 seasons, Jefferson has led the NFL in both receptions and receiving yards. He remains a dominant number 1 receiver and a target monster. Jefferson is a guaranteed fit to ignite the rest of your fantasy football lineup toward winning success. Benny Iyer from Lockdown Fantasy Football is going to help you win your fantasy championship. And eBay Motors knows a championship team is about each player being a perfect fit. The same with your vehicle. With eBay Guaranteed Fit and over 122 million parts and accessories for your vehicle right at your fingertips, you can make sure your ride stays running smoothly. Air filters, brakes, batteries, tail lights, alternators, struts, you name it. eBay Motors has it, and they'll make sure it's the right fit for your car because eBay Guaranteed Fit helps you understand exactly what part you need for your vehicle the first time. So go forth, switch gears, crank the AC, and say goodbye to sweating if your ride needs a little fixing up, because now you know you'll always be set up for success from the get-go. With eBay Guaranteed Fit, everything your vehicle is calling for is just a click away. For the parts and accessories that fit your vehicle, just look for the green check. Get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices at ebaymotors.com. And let's ride. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast. We are debating Dak Prescott versus Tony Romo, a debate that Elliot and I have had numerous times on the phone. Elliot, you brought up supporting cast. And I know people are going to point to the offensive line for Dak Prescott in 2016, and we can get to that. But I think over the course of Prescott's career, he has had a far inferior supporting cast than Tony Romo. What are your thoughts?
No way, because I don't care if there's – I already know what's coming. Tony Romo played with Terrell Owens. He played with Terrell Owens for 3 years, okay? Big deal. What I'm looking at right now is, to me, inarguable. If you look at points allowed, so your defensive supporting cast, Tony Romo was a Cowboys starter from 06 to 2015. And in that time, Marcus, from 06 to 2015, do you know how many top 12 finishes the Cowboys defense had? One. Their next highest was 13th. Now,
was that the 2007 defense?
The 2009 defense was second in points allowed. The 2007 defense was 13th. Okay.
Where were they at in yards, though? That defense was really good in 2007. They had a bunch of Pro Bowlers all over the field.
Yeah, they were 9th in yards allowed, 13th in points. So that's quality. But the point is, that is like high watermark for Romo's career. Now let's look at Dak Prescott's defenses. 5th in points allowed, 7th in points allowed, 11th in points allowed, 6th in points allowed, 5th in points allowed. Dak Prescott has had 5 defenses that had top 12 finishes in his 7 years as a starter. That means he goes out there, he doesn't have to do anything. Which, you know what that means? That means he doesn't have to force the ball in the fourth quarter because they're down 2 touchdowns. He gets garbage points when they're ahead. Tony Romo had to force some throws. So when he had a lot of interceptions, a lot of times it's him trying to keep the team afloat. It's just a totally different scenario. So go ahead. Argue Terrell
I think
Owens
there's
for 3
also
years.
part of like Dak completes a really high percentage of his passes. He runs the ball. Every year that Dak has been the starting quarterback, the Cowboys are like top 5 in rushing. So they're able to control the clock a little bit better, keep their defenses off the field. But my point would be, you mentioned T.O. Yes, T.O. was incredible, but he only played 3 years. Then he had Miles Austin, starting in, was that 2009, really?
Yeah.
Miles became a dominant number 1 receiver. And then he had Des Bryant for his entire peak from 2011 to 2014. On top of that, he had the peak of a Hall of Fame tight end in Jason Witten, where you look at Dak in 2016, he was playing with a kind of a washed up Dez, or at least 2017, a washed up Dez, a washed up Jason Witten. 2018, they had no receivers. That's why they had to go out and trade for Amari Cooper. 2022, this year, they had 1 receiver in CeeDee Lamb, and they were rolling the ball out to a bunch of unproven guys. I think that the receiving core around Dak over the last 5 or 6 years has been extremely poor compared to what Romo had, at least early in his career.
Aren't we kind of missing something here, though? I mean, yeah, I know Miles Austin was a top 10 pick, man. He was – everybody was jonesing to have Miles Austin on their team.
He was really good,
he was an undrafted free agent out of Monmouth who I can make the argument Tony Romo made him good. You know, would Miles Austin have had the production he had with a less accurate quarterback in Dak Prescott? And please don't point to completion percentage, because the kinds of throws and the guys that are running wide open, when you have Ezekiel Elliott his first 4 years in that backfield, the way teams are going to play you are different. You remember the 8 and 9 man boxes that the Cowboys were facing in 2017 and 2018. And that's because no one was afraid of Dak Prescott beating them. And that only changed until they went out and got Amari Cooper. But at the end of the day, even if I were to say, okay, maybe there's some marginal difference in the offensive skill players, if one guy's defense is consistently ranked 25th in points allowed and the other guy's is ranked like 7th or 8th, it doesn't matter. I don't care if you're playing
agree,
with,
but
you know,
those early Wade Phillips defenses in 2000, I guess it would be 2007, 2008, and 2009. Those were good defenses. I know the stats. Well, they really fell off in 2010, right? In 2006 was a Bill Parcells defense, which was very good. I think in those 2010 to 2014 defenses were not good. I'm not arguing that they were not a good defense, but when you combine the skill players with the offensive line that Tony Romo had from, I mean, really his whole career, he played behind some pretty good offensive lines. I think that pushes the edge for me.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just looking at the beginning of Romo's career, and I think people forget how good Romo was out of the gate. They were 4th in points scored in 2006. They were 2nd in points scored in 2007. 2008, they were 18th. But remember, that's when Brad Johnson had to come in and play 5 games, and they could not score a lick.
No, they were awful. They were horrendous.
2009, they dropped to 14, but that's because the defense finally did something. It was 2nd in the NFL in points allowed. So in the fourth quarter, a lot of times the Cowboys could tap the brakes. And also that's when Romo's numbers went up because he didn't have to force the ball. Yeah. I just think it goes to what do you value as supporting cast? And I value offensive line and defense. And to me, this is no comparison. I'm sorry. I love Mark Colombo. I love me some Mark Colombo, but I'm going to take Dak's line for the bulk of his career, even though there was a time when it was a little overrated in Dak's career. And I don't think this is a monumental gap between the two. I don't.
I agree.
I think eyeball test, a little bit of supporting cast, what I value. I think Romo, and then Romo's stats taking a little bit of a dip because he had to press more often than Dak did. That's why I take Romo.
It's just really hard for me to do the pro Dak debate and the anti Tony Romo debate, considering right over my head is an autographed Tony Romo jersey. So obviously I love both of these guys. So it's like picking between your favorite brothers. It's tough, but
can we switch gears for just a moment?
Go ahead. Yes.
I wanted to just throw out that the postseason for these two guys, I think this is really where it gets tough because neither one of them had great success in the postseason. And I think, would you agree that most Cowboy fans would say, okay, Staubach, Aikman, and then it's debatable?
Yes.
Most Cowboy fans.
Yep.
Okay. I know, forget
rational ones, yes.
Yeah, that don't show like Dak versus Aikman's stats.
Sure.
But it's interesting. You have a guy like Danny White, who they went to 3 straight NFC championship games, and he's not mentioned. And, Dak and Tony couldn't get them there at all. The thing that bothers me, you asked me, okay, it's a big playoff game. Which one do you want starting? I don't know that I ever saw Romo or Dak really win the game for the Cowboys. I saw them both have a couple exceptional playoff games. Like you look at Dak Prescott's game against Tampa, man, he was flawless. The defense was, they were all in all cylinders, the whole team, not just Dak. Okay. But I never saw Tony Romo really lose a playoff game. And I did see that last year. Does that bother you at all? Or do you think that's unfair?
I think it's a little unfair. I mean, I agree. Dak did not play a good game.
It probably is a little unfair. I'm gonna edit myself a little bit, but I think you get the point of what I'm saying.
Has Dak already played in more playoff games than Romo?
Well, let's see. He played in 1 and 16, right? He played 2 and 18. That would be 3. He played 1 in 2021. That'd be 4 and 2 last year. So that's 6. He's 2 and 4. Is that right?
2 and 4. Yep.
Okay. Romo lost in 06 against Seattle, lost in 07 against the Giants. That's 2. Beat Philly in 09 and then lost to Minnesota. Oh God, that game was awful. The 09 Minnesota game. Then they went through that run of the 8-8s, right? Then beat the Lions in 14 and then lost to Green Bay. So they're both 2-4.
I've got the numbers right here. I got the numbers. You ready? Dak Prescott's passer rating in the playoffs, 93. Tony Romo's 93. It's pretty incredible. Dak is averaging 7.2 yards per attempt. Romo at 7.1. It's really ridiculous how close the numbers are when you get into the playoffs between these two. And they've got the same record, same amount of games. The stats are almost identical. Dak completing 63% of his passes, Romo at 62. But there's one reason that I think I would take Dak in a big game over Tony Romo. We will get to that next. Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast. We want to thank you for making us your first listen every day. Everydayers, Landon and I will be back on Monday to get you caught up on all of the latest Cowboys news. But today we are finishing up our Dak Prescott versus Tony Romo debate with Elliot Harrison from the Power Rankings show. Elliot, I kind of teased this before the break. The reason that I would take Dak in a big game over Tony Romo has nothing to do with skill, because I actually think Romo's a better passer. He's got better anticipation. He's got a better feel for it. I think there's a calming sense about Dak Prescott where I think in some big games, Romo felt a little too hyped up, almost like an anxious energy. And I wonder if that sometimes bled through the rest of the team in the locker room. Like, you know how this is. You get really excited and pumped up for something. You get this little bit of a nervous energy. I don't feel that with Dak right now.
Yeah, I think there's something about Dak and probably the way he relates to that locker room from day one. I would concede that point. I also think Romo had some big mistakes in I wouldn't call them big games because he won a lot of big games like San Francisco in 2011 from behind. But there became a narrative. And it'd be a national game. I'm thinking of the Peyton Manning duel when he threw for 509 yards,
which wasn't his fault, right? Like
I know
he
slipped on play.
He slipped on his offensive lineman's foot and threw an interception in a game where he threw for 500 yards. Like it's ridiculous.
It's the best interception I've ever seen an inside linebacker make, like ever. Danny Trevathan. But so I could see where some people would lose faith in him, but I think as with most things in sports, you got to, get out of the narrative and get into the nitty gritty. And that's why I kept pointing to the defenses, because the narrative is, oh, he had T.O. It's kind of like saying, oh, Tom Brady was good because he had Randy Moss. I mean, when you really get into it, in my mind, they played in really two different eras, and Tony's era was slightly harder. And the stats will bear that out, so that Romo's stats being equal gives him the advantage there. I think the eyeball test tells me Romo, and then again, the supporting cast. But if we're going to go leadership, I'm going to go Dak on that for sure. And again, I think this is a pretty narrow. I'm not saying Romo's far ahead. I'm just saying I think he's a little bit higher. But it's certainly arguable. I just want somebody to step in and say, hey, Danny White might have been better than both of them.
The one thing that you have going for you is, we both love Danny White. Romo has 4 Pro Bowls. He also has an All-Pro selection. Dak only has 2 Pro Bowl selections in his career, has never had an All-Pro. It does seem like Romo's peak or his zenith might have been a little bit higher. I think I just value the consistency and the rushing ability. Like just having that, especially early on in his career, was so hard for defenses to stop. And it made that Cowboys offense so dynamic. And it's why you look at the Cowboys offensive ranks every year that Prescott has played, more than 12 games. And they're like number 1 in the league in points per game. But again, I can see this is really close. I don't think either guy was a top 3 quarterback during their era, but I think they're both comfortably top 10 quarterbacks from the time that they started.
Yeah. I was just thinking, just one last thing, because what's our timing here? How much time do I have?
We got a couple minutes left.
Final points. Okay. Sorry guys, I'm not used to the locked on format. So just do my best here. I would say that one of the points you made on Dak that I totally agree with is, as a runner, that's why 2018 Dak Prescott, I'm thinking of the Seattle playoff game, right? Really tough to stop. But I think when a guy doesn't run, we also maybe don't look at why he doesn't run and what a strength that might be. Tony Romo's release was so quick. I mean, do we ever criticize Dan Marino because he didn't run? No, because Dan Marino got the ball out. Tom Brady gets the ball out. Tony Romo got the ball out. And so I think that was also a strength, to his side. And I think we should look at that. And in 2020, when the defense was absolutely horrible, what did the Cowboys go with Dak? Was it 1-4 or 1-5? I'm trying to remember which. Now, look, Romo had a bad year in 2010 before he got hurt, so this is probably not fair, but I'm always look at that 2013 team and how bad they were defensively, and the fact that they were 8-7 in a position to win. They lose to Philadelphia. You remember this game? It was a Sunday night game.
Stupid Brandon Boykin picked off Kyle Orton to end their season.
And what were all the memes after the game? This is the kind of thing Dak Prescott has never had to deal with, this narrative. The memes where Orton pulls his helmet off and it's Tony Romo's head on the Orton jersey that threw the interception. That's the kind of stuff Dak Prescott just never has had to deal with. He's always been kind of a darling with the media and with the fans, and he's finally facing some of the music. And I don't want people to be hard on him. I'm just saying, I think he's finally getting that criticism that Tony Romo had almost his entire career. Would you agree with that?
I think we're getting there. Over the last couple of years, I think we're starting to get there where you're seeing the national media maybe take some shots at him that aren't quite fair. Like he's not talented enough to take the Cowboys to the NFC Championship game, or that the Cowboys should look to replace him. I just think all that
neither one of us want. I don't want them to be unfair. I'm just saying that I think Romo dealt with a lot of unfair scrutiny for a long time.
100% agree. But unfortunately for Dak, if they can't advance past the divisional round, I think that stuff is only going to continue to get louder and louder. That is it for today's show. We want to thank you for making Locked On Cowboys your first listen every day. Everydayers, Landon and I will be back on Monday to wrap up all the latest Cowboy news, so make sure you tune in for that. We want to thank Elliot for jumping on today's show. He's going to be back over the next couple of weeks to do some fun other little debates that we've been just talking about. So make sure you guys are listening to that. Go follow Elliot on Twitter at Harrison NFL. I'm at Marcus_Mosier. Locked On Cowboys podcast is free and available on all platforms. And we will see you guys next time.